Well, we have a good number of people here today, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the conversation. We're recording the webinar, just so you all know, so please keep that in mind. My name is Lori Bartzak, and I'm here today with Community Wealth Partners, and I'll be your host for today. I also want to thank my colleague, Lori Valerio, who you can probably see. Lori is managing the technology and registration for today's gathering. And I just want to tell you a little bit about who we are. Community Wealth Partners is a social sector consulting firm. We work with foundations and nonprofits to develop strategies, we help implement plans, and we help with capacity building and evaluation as well. We've been around for more than 20 years, and we were created by the nonprofit Share Our Strength. Many of you have probably seen a lot about No Kid Hungry in the past couple of months. That's the biggest program that Share Our Strength runs, and they've been, over the years, serving over 1 billion meals to children in an effort to fight childhood hunger and providing some really critical services right now. So today we're here to talk about earned revenue strategies for nonprofits. We really want this to be as engaging as possible. We do have a little bit of presentation from our speakers, but the bulk of the conversation is here just to answer your questions, because I know people are coming with a lot of questions top of mind, and we want to devote as much time as we can to that. Because we have a large number of people on the call today, we're going to ask that we use the chat function to share our questions. So you can see on the screen some directions for how to type your questions in using the chat box in Zoom. Great. So with that, I am going to give quick introductions to our speakers today. First, I'd like to introduce Sandra Moore. Sandra works with me at Community Wealth Partners, and she is a director there where she leads client relationships and supports the development of our firm's strategy practice. We also have two guest speakers from the nonprofit Scholas here today with us, and they're here to share their story of how they created an earned revenue strategy, as well as some of what the organization is going through now. So first, I'd like to introduce Plinio Ayala. Plinio is the CEO of the organization. He's been the CEO since 2003, and before that served as the Vice President of Operations, so he can speak to a long history of the organization. Also today we have with us Damian Howard, and Damian is the Executive Vice President of Social Ventures. In that role, he's responsible for launching and scaling revenue generating enterprises that fuel innovation and provide capital to the organization. And Damian is here to help Sandra answer your technical questions. So without further ado, we'll get started with just some of the content, and I'm going to hand it over to Sandra. Can't hear you, Sandra.
There we go. I think
there, that works better.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Thank you. I'm excited to be with you all today. We thought we'd start with just a definition of earned revenue. So we think about it as a source of funding in exchange for something of direct value. So that could be fee for service, it could be product sales, it could be membership dues. And it's valuable for nonprofits because it's unrestricted funds. It can help you diversify revenue, especially if your organization right now is dependent on one or two big funders or contracts. And it can help you expand your reach and maybe reach new groups that you haven't reached before or in a different kind of way. If we could flip to the next slide. So I will say that earned revenue has its risks too, right? So in this moment, Nonprofit Finance Fund just did a survey asking nonprofits with earned revenue streams what they were experiencing. And as you can see from those top two green bars, a lot of them are seeing a reduction in earned revenue right now because earned revenue fluctuates with customer demand. Things like ticket sales, discretionary funding, trainings and classes have all dropped off steeply. That said, there are some nonprofits with earned revenue streams, and you can see them in that second set of bars, that are experiencing an increase in demand right now or expect it to increase in the future. And those are likely services that are maybe virtual services, replacing things that used to be done in person, or things that are crucial to surviving in the pandemic. So for example, we know one organization that has a one-stop database of food services, of healthcare, of a lot of other public goods. And their products are in high demand right now. So I think that raises the question on the next slide of whether this is the right time for an earned revenue strategy. We know that revenue is on the minds of a lot of nonprofits right now, but we would urge you to consider, is this the moment to launch an earned revenue strategy or to start planning for one? So a couple of things to consider if you're thinking about launching right now. Your goal should really be long-term sustainability, not quick revenue. We know that a successful earned revenue strategy can take years to achieve its full revenue potential. It can be highly valuable, but it's rarely a short-term revenue fix. So if you really need income right now, we would encourage you to think about sources like funders, like individual donors. Those are typically a faster way to income. The second thing to think about is that your venture should be mission related. So in a time of crisis, it can be tempting to go after anything that seems like a possible source of revenue. But an earned revenue venture takes a lot of energy from your staff. And if it's not mission related, then it can draw energy away from your core purpose. Also, if you are having to develop a lot of new skills and knowledge, if it's not related to your core mission, that will make it harder to be successful. The third piece is that you should already have the asset in-house that you want to use. So when I say asset, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but that's sort of the core piece of knowledge or the physical asset that you could use to develop an earned revenue product or service. So for example, maybe you have a training that you currently offer to your network that you think could be marketed externally. Or maybe you have a food delivery service for your clients that you think could be expanded to paying customers. Or maybe you know a lot about a particular topic, you have expertise in something that you think you could use to offer consulting. Those are examples of assets you may already have in-house that you wouldn't have to invest a ton to turn into an earned revenue product. Along those same lines, the fourth one, you should be able to pilot with minimal financial investment. So as you all know, now is the time to conserve cash. So think about, how much effort would it really take to get this off the ground, to offer it to a few potential customers? And if you can do it without major time or resources, now might be the time. So, if you don't meet these criteria, I think that there's still value in thinking about earned revenue, because now can be a good time to start doing some of the planning, some of the research that we're going to talk about that will lead you to an eventual earned revenue strategy, even if now is not the right time to launch it. So how do you think about an earned revenue strategy? We really think about it as the intersection of three things. So first, a marketable asset. I shared some examples of these just a few minutes ago, but it's basically an organizational resource that could be a product or service for others. So skills you have, data you possess, connections, networks, maybe a service you provide for free today, like an energy audit, for example, that you could charge customers for. There's a lot of different types of assets that might have value in the market. The second piece of this is the market opportunity. So who is the audience that might have a need for your product or service, and what is the need that it will meet for them? And then the third piece is organizational capacity. So does your organization have the right skills, the processes, the systems, and the culture to deliver on an earned revenue product? And even if you don't today, it's a journey of building that such that your marketable asset, the opportunity it meets, and the capacity that you have to deliver all work together to be that earned revenue product or service. So as you think about, do you have a feasible earned revenue opportunity? There's a couple steps we recommend that you take. And I should say that we put out a detailed field guide that outlines all of what I'm talking through in much more detail. So I would recommend that to you if you want to dig more deeply into this. But at a high level, we suggest that you start by clarifying the criteria you'll use to decide if an earned revenue opportunity makes sense. So on the slide here, you see 4 criteria that we often use. So what's the potential for impact? How will this help you advance your mission? What's the potential for revenue? Does it have a meaningful return compared to your organizational budget? And that's a combination of whether customers are interested in your product and how much they're willing to pay for it. The level of effort, is this going to be a major investment of changing your organizational systems, your operations to deliver, or is it something you can do fairly easily? And what's the level of risk, to your reputation? What's the risk of failure? What are the consequences if this doesn't work out? And I should say there's no perfect earned revenue product. This is really about thinking about the trade-offs between these things and what makes sense for your organization to launch. So once you have your criteria in place, we suggest you do some initial brainstorming with your team about what are the different assets you possess, what might make sense to turn into an earned revenue product or service, and take an initial pass at rating them against these criteria. See what comes out on top and pick the 2 to 3 that are most promising. From there, we suggest you conduct some external market research. And that can sound a little bit intimidating, but really it can be as simple as a 20-minute conversation with some people you think might be potential customers, to share what you're thinking about, to get their feedback, to ask what they pay for similar services and products, and to get a sense of whether there actually is a market for what you want to do. And then to have some internal conversations with your team about, if we really did launch this, what would it take? From there, we go into pilot testing. So we really consider pilot testing to be a second phase of market research. It's not like you do the feasibility assessment and then you go full speed ahead. We suggest that you pilot it with a small group of customers to really learn and refine what you're offering. So for the opportunities that you decide are feasible, craft a pilot that starts small, maybe with a handful of customers, maybe with sort of the minimum viable product that you can put together. Create a process that allows you to learn constantly. So understand what you're trying to learn, come up with how you're going to measure it, and then make sure you're building in those checkpoints through the process to say, what have we learned? What do we need to change? How can we make this better for our customers? And be patient. The pilot period will take some time. Learning and refining will take some time, so don't cut it short. And then the last one, don't be afraid to back out. That's what the pilot process is for. You may learn that an earned revenue opportunity doesn't work, and that's okay. Better to find out in the pilot stage than later on. So I'd love to turn it over to Plinio from Scholas to tell us a little bit about their experience with earned revenue.
Absolutely. Well, it's a thrill to be with all of you this afternoon. Lori, thank you both for inviting Scholas to be part of this session. And Sandra, it's a pleasure to be on this panel with you and with my colleague Damien. 25 years ago, we were founded as a social enterprise, doing very different work than what we've evolved into. But at the time, we were dealing with the issue of the digital divide, specifically in the South Bronx, and eventually expanded that to a number of regions. But we would go out to the corporate community and solicit their end-of-life computer equipment. And the good stuff we would refurbish and make it available at cost to families in our communities and to schools that couldn't afford to buy new ones. And we got to the point where we were producing about 10,000 computers a year. And the end-of-life dead equipment, we would dispose of it in an environmentally safe way, but we charged companies to dispose of that equipment and began to create a revenue stream that allowed us to focus on, in many ways, it was sort of happenstance that we realized that we were training a local workforce to fix these computers, and within 6 months, they were leaving us. And as we began to dig deeper as to the why, we determined that now they had a skill that translated into a lot more money in the market. And so that social revenue that we were realizing allowed us to pilot courses in IT. And over time, as the digital divide and the internet became more ubiquitous, cost of computers came down, we couldn't compete at that price point. So we divested ourselves of that work, except the asset recovery piece that Damon will talk to in a few minutes, and invested all of our time and effort in IT workforce development. And what's emerged is a national organization that's training about 2,500 people a year in 12 sites, and hopefully post-COVID will be at 15 locations across the country. And as we began that strategy to scale, right in the heart of the recession in 2008, I realized that being dependent on the largesse of foundations and corporations was not enough to really realize scale, that we needed to come up with a different revenue strategy that can help us serve more people. And so we got some capital and invested in a placement agency. We created our own temp agency and realized that that was such a mature market we couldn't compete. We immediately turned that off, but we learned a number of valuable lessons there. We learned from employers that the talent was extremely good, and that if we were able to customize training that dealt with specific issues and specific skill sets that they couldn't find in the market, that they would be willing to pay us to cover the cost of training. And so what evolved from that was a customized training model that now gives us the opportunity to work with employers to create training tracks that are specific to them, and they're paying us to cover the cost. And that really has precipitated an increase in scale. And I think that revenue stream, along with private philanthropy, will get us into a number of other cities in the near future, and hopefully go deeper in the cities that we're in now. So I'm going to pause and pass it over to Damien, who can talk specifically about customized training. But the picture on the screen is a picture of one of our graduates in Philadelphia, Davida. And I'll come back to Davida's story hopefully at some point later on. But Damien, why don't you talk about customized training? And you're on mute, Dee.
Hello.
Yep, we can hear you, Damien.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Yep, thank you.
Great. Sorry about that. And thank you, Plenio, and hello, everyone. So yes, when we thought about customized training, one of the things we started to see were very prevalent trends inside of the industry. So we noticed that businesses had obliterated established industry lines and ways of thinking and ways of doing business, especially when it came to sourcing our talent acquisition, which opened the door for new ways of thinking, for innovative measures that we can implement in order to make sure that we dug deeper inside of an organization and we sort of broke ourselves out of what I would call an echo chamber. Because many times in social services or inside a nonprofit organization, we get together and we think deeply, we run over data together, and then rarely do we take a very consultative approach to understand the needs of our employer partner, in our case, to really build out a sound solution that matches their pain points and really bring solutions that they can run with. So as Plenio mentioned, out of that recession, when we were working with Time Warner Cable, we began to say, hey, how could we become more proactive about engaging with clients and understanding what those pain points are and prescribing solutions that not only allowed them to engage with us from a point of philanthropy, but allowed them to commit to us in a way where they would pay us for the services and where we would provide sound value for them in order to keep them moving and to scale the relationship. So we had to shift our thinking a little bit. We now understood that in order to do this correctly, the customer had to define the journey, which means that you have to take a consultative approach to really get to the point of understanding what their needs are, and then build the bench of talent internally so that you can be flexible enough and nimble enough to respond quickly to those clients' demands once you're able to suss them out from the client. So we said, hey, let's put the employer partner, because we always say that we have a dual constituency model. So of course, it's always going to be the students that we serve. Our mission will never change. Our focus will never change. And that will be critical when you're thinking about launching a social venture. It's just making sure that the messaging, the mission, the vision remains the same, and that you're very repetitive about that, because you will see some growing pains as you make this transition if this is the road that you decide to go down. But we flipped that equation on its head, and we said the customer defines the journey. And now we understood that customers' expectations were much higher, and customers demand personalized experiences in every facet of the engagement, regardless of whatever product or service you were delivering. So we took that approach on, and we started to dig. We started to dig and work alongside of our employer partners and ask the right questions so that we could build out the right solution. And then we landed at a place where we said, okay, we understand that most of our instructors come with not only educational experience, but they actually come with relevant IT workspace experience. So we were wondering, how could we leverage that skill set and that talent, that bench of talent that we've had, in order to build out content, curriculum, coursework, and then deliver on-site and virtual training for our clients. And by taking that approach, we landed in the space after working with Time Warner Cable. We decided to go after Cognizant with that mental model and business approach in mind, and it worked. So now we're working with Cognizant, with Infosys, with Capital One, Synchrony, and many others throughout the country, all based on this social venture that wasn't a far leap for us as far as the operation is concerned, because we're still in training, we're still in place, we're still in the business of getting people placed into sustainable careers. But what we started to do was shift the dynamic, no longer being insular and just reviewing information ourselves, but really getting external and gathering that data. And then what we did was we built the bench internally, and we set the culture internally to make this shift towards revenue generation. So what do I mean by that? We realized that internally, the talent that we needed had to be business minded, but mission focused. Because once you start moving in this direction, there will be people who will dig deep on their position around, we have to just be a nonprofit, we cannot generate revenue, and you'll see a culture dynamic begin to surface while you're making this transition, which is why you have to just continuously circle back all of your activities around the social venture back to the mission. And for us, it was a little bit easier, even though we've had a lot of growing pains, because Plenio is innovative. So it came from the leader down, and we had to reiterate that over and over again. And you're going to have to do that while you make that transition, because in order to make this work, you have to make sure that you have the right people on your team. Because it can become very laborious if you don't. So a constant focus on mission and vision while you're organizing and developing your social venture, and consistently pointing staff back to that so that you can move in the right direction. So I can talk forever. I'm gonna stop there just to see if I should pass it off to anyone or if there's any other questions that I can ask.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Damien and Plenio. Yeah, so that was the context that we wanted to start the conversation with. And now we really just want to open it up to answer questions for the rest of the time so that you all can get, what matters most to you. So we'll be teeing your questions. You can let me know if there's someone specific you're hoping to hear from, and I'll keep an eye on that, or I will decide who I'll ask the questions. And while we're waiting for the first question to come in, I do have some that people sent in their registration forms. And so I'm going to start with some of the ones that we heard already online. And one of the questions that a lot of people had was along the lines of needing some help understanding, what can we do as a 501c3 without risking our tax exemption? So Sandra, I'm going to ask you to speak to that first, and then maybe Plenio or Damien, one of you could speak to how you thought about that for your organization. But Sandra, what advice do you have?
Yeah, I know that's a common question and an important one. And I want to say that we at Community Wealth Partners are not lawyers, so I can't give legal advice. And we would definitely recommend that you consult a lawyer or an accountant if you have tax questions. That said, we do know that many nonprofits have found a way to earn substantial income within their existing structures. And so you can probably do more than you think you can do. So for example, one of the organizations we profiled in this set of case studies that we recently put out, the center, it's called CCLP, they work on juvenile justice issues, increased their revenue from 15%, earned revenue from 15% of their budget to 40% of their budget by offering mission-aligned services to the juvenile justice system. So it's certainly possible to do a lot within the structure, and I would urge you to consult your lawyer on the specifics.
I mean, I knew enough that I knew nothing about tax law, but I needed to get a lawyer involved, right? So we were lucky enough to have a board member who is a lawyer who then got in contact with a tax lawyer. And they determined that our work was completely aligned with our mission, and gave us sort of the nod that we'd be okay with the IRS. So the feedback was positive, and we continue to do that, and consult with that lawyer periodically as we might be adding a new training track or working with a different company. We go back and just verify that we're still on track with the IRS, and so far so good.
Great, thank you. Mark has just chatted in a question, and the question is, what about viewing municipalities, school districts, and other government entities as customers? I know from the case studies that we published just recently that there are organizations doing that. There's an example that we wrote up about Food and Friends, looking at how to get Medicaid reimbursements as a source of revenue. So I guess from my knowledge, I would say the answer is yes. But Sandra, is there anything more that you would want to say in response to that question?
Yeah, I definitely think a lot of organizations look at municipalities and particularly school districts as customers, and that's a great thing to do. I think in our experience researching opportunities with school districts, there can be, and I would say municipalities as well, can be a very specific sales process for those kinds of customers in terms of who the decision maker is, the timelines required to work with them, sort of what the decision factors are. So I think that is sort of the reason you do market research and have conversations with potential customers about, what's the need that you have, who's going to make a decision about purchasing, what are the factors that they're thinking about, what influences them. But absolutely, those kinds of institutions can be great customers, and in some ways, there's advantages of a predictable budget cycle and those kinds of things with those kinds of customers.
Yeah, thank you. The next question, Damien, I'm going to ask you to start because you already alluded to this, but we did get a number of questions in advance around kind of bringing the staff along to the idea of charging for services. When you're a mission-driven organization, sometimes organizations are making decisions to charge for things that used to be provided for free. And so from kind of a vision and values perspective, that can be challenging. So yeah, what advice do you have for folks on that, Damien? And then Sandra, I'll ask you to chime in as well.
Sure. So to that point, culture is everything. So when you're going through that process, and just to double click on what was just said around who you're targeting within that market, one of the things that you want to do is just go through that general buyer persona. And you can get that from your staff internally. And by asking them these questions around who have we been successful with previously? What has our track record been? And who have we landed the most business with or gained the most traction with over the years? Starting there and including them from the very beginning, that will help you bring people along because you want them to be a part of the process. You really want to get that consensus built in as much as possible and what's reasonable and functional from the front end. So including your staff from the very beginning. The other thing I would suggest is, as leaders of organizations, the one question that I believe we have to ask all of ourselves is, do we trust our employees enough when we're going through this kind of a transition? Do we trust them enough to tell them the truth about where we're going, where we are, and what we need to do to get to that next phase? And be transparent and be extremely transparent as you go through this process, because you're going to have that well of trust filled in order to make this transition, because it is a mental model shift. It is a business operational shift, and that can be difficult for many people. So be as transparent as possible, and be transparent early and often throughout that process, and include them in the decision-making process from the very beginning, down to understanding what your buyer persona is, understanding what that sales funnel process looks like. And you think about the trigger points. You want to be able to bring them through that whole process, because that's how you bring them along. And you have the opportunity at each point of that engagement to set the culture and tone. So one of the things that I consistently told my teams while we were making this transition is that you have to understand the mindset that I'm approaching this business at. And for me, it was fail fast, fail cheap. And the third step is codify, learn, and share, and then move on. That's the process of innovation. And that's what I drilled into the team. Listen, failure is not fatal. So it gets people more in the position to deal with rigor and take a little bit more calculated risk inside of a controlled space, which then sets the culture, and then it also informs behaviors after that. So we fail fast, fail cheap, codify, learn, and share, and move on. And just doing those things from the very beginning, including them, understanding the kind of culture and business approach that you want, understanding messaging, understanding your targets, and then setting that, just that mantra from the beginning will help the culture move along as you dive into this new social venture.
Yeah, I would echo what Damien said. I think the transparency, the bringing people along to making sure the staff is there at every step of the way, that is absolutely critical. I think the only other thing I would add to that is I think the piloting process can be helpful if you're starting small, if you're sharing the lessons learned as you go, if you're having honest conversations with people as their roles are shifting about what they feel equipped to do, where they may need training, and being really thoughtful about, as this grows, not at the beginning, but what new skills are you going to need to bring in from the outside? What new processes are you going to need to put in place? What new systems are you going to need? You know, as you get into sales, you need different systems, you need different skills. And that, you know, some of that you can train, and some of it you may need to bring in people who have it already.
Yeah. And Plinio, I'm wondering, from your role as CEO, were there similar things you had to do with the board to bring the board along with how the thinking was evolved and how the organization was evolving?
Yeah, absolutely. And transition some folks off that couldn't make the adjustment. And I think that's an important point. I think when you take a leap like this, as Damien mentioned, if people aren't aligned culturally, it could be very destructive for the organization. And so you need to figure out where those impediments are and try to fix them, or you gotta get rid of them. And so we had to do that on the board. But generally, the board understood that if we were going to serve more people, that this had to be part of what we did. And frankly, this whole social entrepreneurship has always been part of the DNA of the organization from the very beginning. So it wasn't a huge shift for the organization and the board, but it was for some folks, and they needed to transition off.
Great, thank you. Again, just a reminder for people on the line to feel free to go ahead and chat in your questions. But I still have a list, so I'll keep pulling from that list while we wait. Another question that we heard a lot in advance, also I think values and vision come to play here, and it had to do with pricing. So how do you balance, again, a social mission, wanting to be equitable and thinking about pricing, and also the need to generate revenue to sustain the mission of the organization and the work that you're doing? So Plinio, maybe I'll ask you first your advice on that question.
Yeah, Lori, do me a favor. Can you bring up that picture of Davida?
Just
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Well, I'll answer that within the context of Davida's story, right? Davida is a longtime Philadelphian who had suffered a number of violent episodes when she was younger. But she persevered. She got her high school diploma and went to college, but couldn't afford to stay. And so dropped out in her freshman year, and shortly thereafter started a family. But Davida realized that she, in her minimum wage job, wasn't going to make enough to support her two kids. And so she found this organization called Scholas, who had just established a partnership with a company called Tech Systems and opened an office in Philadelphia. She finished her 15 weeks of training. And she now works with Tech Systems at Trinity Healthcare, making more money than she ever dreamed she could make. And I would never have met Davida if we hadn't gone down this revenue generation stream, right? We would never have gone to Philadelphia if it wasn't for Tech Systems. And there are hundreds of people just like Davida we are impacting every single day. And it's not just Davida's life, right? You look at those two cute kids, their lives will be different forever as a result that mom now has a job that's paying well, she has healthcare, all of that good stuff. And so we charge appropriately to Tech Systems for that talent. She is incredibly valuable to Tech Systems. They are a managed service provider. She's working at a client site. There is a margin that Tech Systems puts on Davida's hourly wage, and they make money off of her. And so at the very least, they should be covering what now has become a very huge return on that investment. So, you know, don't be shy. As long as the return is exactly what the customer is getting, don't be shy to charge whatever the cost of doing that business is. I think they'd appreciate that, and they're paying it now. other talent providers. So yeah, I have no problem sort of, there's no struggle with sort of putting the right price tag on the development of that talent.
Thank you. Damien, did you want to add something? You're muted. Oh,
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay. To Plenio's point, I mean, just from a very tactical standpoint, the model that we launched initially and we still abide by is cost plus. So just strictly look at what it costs for you to deliver that model, that business model, and then figure out what margin you can live with from there. So for us, we aim for anywhere from a 10 to 20% margin on any deals. Now, of course, you know, when you're piloting, there will be early adopter fees. So you may want to cut it in half or just, you know, have a percentage that you knock off just to get a big client on that can potentially lead into a larger engagement. But the best and safest pricing model will be cost plus. Cover your cost and then figure out what you're comfortable with as far as margin is concerned.
Okay.
Yeah, but I would, just to echo that and add a little bit to that, the return has to be there, right? The quality of the product. This is not about altruism.
Right.
That company is not investing in you because yes, they're going to feel good that they're working with a student that is coming from a marginalized situation. But if that person can't deliver, that relationship is going to go away very quickly. And so you also have to make sure that you're not overpricing yourself compared to other customers that they might be working with. So I think all of that is part of the equation, but there should be no fear in charging, in our case, employers, because the value is there.
Yeah. Sandra, I'm going to ask you another follow-up question related to this. Just came in about, you know, just how to set pricing with your values in mind. People have asked about sliding scale, tiered pricing. And so I think especially when you're selling a service or a product to the same community, the same constituents that you're hoping to help, if you want to give some advice for folks to think about that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that because that's a question that comes up a lot. And so I think to Damien and Plenio's point, it is important to understand what your costs are going to be, but also to think about, you know, what is your goal with this? Is it to make a profit? Is it to expand your impact and cover more of the costs than you would have if you'd gone through philanthropy alone? So it's important to get clear on what kind of financial return you need from this. But then within that, once you understand what your boundaries are, yeah, we do see a lot of organizations doing tiered pricing. So for example, if you're serving nonprofits, if you're selling a product to nonprofits, maybe you set the price based on their size and budget. For example, larger organizations can typically pay more. You could take the same sliding scale approach to individuals as well. Some people do like a freemium model where they offer a basic product that they consider important for making impact, and they offer premium services on top of that. So for example, we had a client who had a data set of health outcomes, and they felt it was really important from an impact perspective to make that free to everybody. But then they offered consulting on how to use it on top of that for other customers. So I think there are different models you can use based on your goals and the values that you have in place and what you're trying to get from earned revenue.
Great, thanks. Another question that we just got from Amira. What advice do you have on the balance between customization to meet clients' unique needs and keeping that initial level of effort low, especially when in the pilot phase? Sandra, can I ask you to come first?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great question because customization often does entail different costs and greater costs. And so I would say, you know, in the pilot, I would keep it limited. You know, you're testing it with a handful of customers. So hopefully you can offer sort of the minimum viable product. You're not customizing all over the place. Maybe you're developing a product that you know is going to resonate with a small group of customers. And then you're sort of building from there. In the beginning, as you get going, you may find yourself doing a little bit more customization just to get people in the door. But over time, you'll have a sense of what the what the broadest needs of the marketplace are, and you can make a choice between offering a really standard product that's probably a little bit lower cost and something that's really customized that your customers are probably going to have to pay a little bit more for, or somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Scholas has thoughts on this too. I imagine it's something you all have dealt with.
Damien, do you want to chime in?
Oh yeah, that is actually spot on. I mean, you start with what you have available to you as far as resources, talents, and competencies are concerned. You just really have to figure out what's in your wheelhouse and what you can deliver, and just start there so that you can somewhat play it safe and not overextend your organization. I mean, you have to stretch just a little bit, but you want to make sure that you pilot somewhat comfortably in order to get those lessons learned in a controlled environment and move on from there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I see a question that just came in from Andrea. Andrea, can I ask you to just say your question, because I'm not sure I understand it, so maybe a little more from you would be helpful. Is that okay with you? Okay. Yeah, go ahead and share your question, Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, this is Andrea. So a follow-up question on the pricing. So we've been talking through project staffing and pricing for earned revenue projects, and sometimes on these projects we use consultants. And so I'm wondering if you have policies or guidelines around how much to charge or how much consultants charge on a project where you're generating when you're generating a profit, like what's ethical, what's in line with organizational values, because you may not want to pay consultants this much if the multiplier might be like 3 times or 4 times what the consultant is actually doing. Does that make sense? Thanks. So it's around staffing for a project and pricing.
Thanks. Does anybody want to take that? I don't know, Damien, if you've had experience thinking about that.
Sure. I'm just trying to make sure that I deeply understand the question. So I'm assuming that the business model that you guys have, you apply consultants from your business to other businesses, and you're trying to figure out what the right pricing should be for those consultants. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yes, so we've dealt with companies like what I mentioned earlier, which was Cognizant and Infosys, and when we've dealt with other staffing agencies, because we did have a staffing agency sort of model earlier on in our life cycle here at Scholas as well. Again, we thought about what the market norms were, and then we tried to either just come below that without cutting into what it costs for us to deliver that service, in order to make sure that we had that competitive advantage. So that's how we normally have priced it out, figuring out what the market has been charging and what your competitors are really charging, which is sort of like the focal point of where you need to start, and if you could, just based on your operational expenses, if you could come in just a hair or significantly, if you can afford to do that, come in significantly less so that you can win the business. And that's sort of like the benchmark that we use when we were pricing out these kinds of models.
Sandra, anything you want to add on that?
No, I think that sounds right to me.
Andrea, thumbs up or thumbs down? Did that answer your question? Can you show a thumbs up or thumbs down if we answered it? You somewhat? Okay. Well, you can feel free to follow up with us afterwards too. Okay, thank you. Yeah, we have maybe 10 more minutes for questions if people want to continue to chat in any questions. Another question that we got heard quite a few times in the advance was thinking about once you have an earned revenue strategy in place, what are strategies to grow the effort and hopefully generate more revenue? Sandra, can I ask you to comment on that first?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple ways to think about it, right? If you have an earned revenue strategy in place, you could say, how do we expand what we're doing to reach more people? So sort of a scaling strategy. You could also think about, are there other ways we can serve our customers, like the same customers, different products? I think for it, or you could think about totally different products, totally different customer group, which is probably the hardest thing to do. But I think for any of those, it's a similar process to the one you followed when you were thinking about the original earned revenue strategy. So figuring out what assets do you have, who's the audience, and what need does it meet for them, and doing that market research to figure out, is this actually feasible, and then doing some pilot testing. if you're just scaling your original strategy, you don't have to do the asset part, but you would want to talk to customers in another market to see, does my product translate? Is it meeting a need? Are there competitors there that I haven't been facing in my current market? What do I need to think about as I start to reach new populations or scale up? And I think, especially if you're scaling, there's some of that, the internal capacity questions as well. Do we have the staffing? Do we have the skills? What are the processes and systems we need to make more formal if we're going to serve a higher volume?
Thanks. Damien, any insights on that question that you want to share?
Sure. I mean, that was spot on as well. The only other thing that I would add is that while you're doing this, and this is where you may have to make a decision on whether or not you need a new skill set inside of your company, because you will need business-minded and sales-driven individuals to really push your product in the market. And even while you're trying to figure out what to target inside of the market, you should always think about value. I often tell our clients that price is what you pay, value is what you get. And while you're developing this go-to-market strategy, you should always think about what pain points can I solve, because that's what motivates clients to pay. What am I solving and how can I make this easier for you? So for us, just as an example, what we did when we were defining what we wanted to do, we knew that we could provide a diverse talent pipeline that reduced time to placement, which is a big thing for employers, because the longer the vacancy, the more money that they're spending on trying to source for that role, pulling on other resources within the company to try to support the vacancy that is there. We also knew that they would have significant savings on talent acquisition, just the entire process, and turnover costs, because we can impact retention as we move forward. And then we looked at organizational alignment around corporate social responsibility. So we have 4 or 5 value points that we know we can drive with the client, and we started there, and then that's how we sold the service. So it's critically important to start from that point as well.
Great, thank you. We got an interesting question from Mark. Does earned revenue sometimes lead to grant money? For example, has a client turned into a donor? Plinio, have you seen that at Scholas with any of the tech companies that you've worked with or other clients of your services?
Often. I think philanthropy loves the idea of organizations generating different streams of revenue, right? And if that allows you to scale and serve more people, I think using grant money as the capital needed to launch this type of activity is incredibly valuable. And so we've had a number of our employer partners who have provided grant dollars to continue to invest in the business so that we can continue to grow it.
Great. And Sandra, have you seen similar examples from your experience?
Yeah, I think not as many. I think because I'm not always involved in that later stage of the process. We're more at the start of the process. But where I have seen philanthropy plug in, as Plinio said, oftentimes there's opportunities for startup funding from philanthropy. They like to see this get off the ground. So a number of our clients, when starting out an earned revenue strategy, have had philanthropic support to do the pilot phase, to hire new staff. A lot of that, I think that's where we see philanthropy plugging in the most.
And then on the other side of that, has a client become a donor? Like, have you seen examples of this kind of maybe helping extend your network to reach more? So I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that. Maybe to reach donors or relationships that you wouldn't have had before, was how I was reading that question.
I think that yes. So the answer is yes. I think it's interesting that we've got a number of different training tracks, and so there could be some training tracks that particular employer may not be hiring for, but sees the value of our work and invests in a training track that they feel really excited about, may not benefit from, but see the value of helping the space out. And so we have seen that on occasion from a number of employer partners.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to make a final call. If you do have any burning questions, you can go ahead and chat them in, and we might be able to get to 1 or 2 more. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a question. Sandra, to put you on the spot. You had talked a little bit about, for some people right now might not be the right time to launch a strategy, but to do some of that back end planning. What are some steps that you might recommend just for getting started?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first step in this is really figuring out what are the assets you have that might have value on the market. And so we often do that as a brainstorming. This can be a great way to start bringing your staff along, right? So having those brainstorming sessions with your staff. And our field guide is a good resource in how to think about this, how to think about what could be an asset, but skills, experiences, data, knowledge, physical spaces, all of those things can be assets. So really get the creative juices going with your staff and come up with that list. And then start to think about, what is viable and have some of those conversations with customers. I know some people are super busy right now and may not be reachable, but a lot of people actually have some extra time right now and might be willing to talk with you about what needs they see now, and importantly, what needs they see coming down the pike when this pandemic passes, because I think we're going to see a shift in the opportunities that are out there. So how can you start thinking ahead right now, envisioning that future, doing a little bit of scenario planning and thinking about how earned revenue opportunities fit into that and testing that with potential customers? This is a great time for that.
Great, thank you. Well, since we're about out of time, I think I'll go ahead and wrap us up. And I'm just going to ask each of our speakers to share just a few sentences of advice for everybody on the call. So Plinio, can I start with you? What advice do you have for everyone today?
It sounds so counterintuitive, right? Because of the situation we're all in, but don't be afraid to take risks, right? They've got to be calculated. They've got to be strategic. But as Sandra mentioned, this new world that we've embarked on will provide a number of opportunities that we can all take advantage of. And I think having a higher tolerance of risk at this point for me is actually something that I would encourage people to consider.
Thank you, Plinio. Damien, what advice do you have?
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, be bold and act now. This new world that we're working in or that we're living in will provide an enormous amount of opportunities. So I would suggest to be aggressive and of course calculated and extremely well planned, but don't be afraid to venture out. Be extremely focused on aligning vision, culture, and internal infrastructure to get it done. And then at the end of the day, just focus on delivering value at scale. And I'll always circle back to fail fast, fail cheap, codify, learn, and share, and then move on.
That's great advice. Thank you. And Sandra, what advice do you have?
Yeah, I would say I would echo everything that's been said and also add, keep impact at the center and know what you want to get out of this. So, make sure that even as you're going after this, it's mission aligned, because that things that are aligned with your mission and what you know are more likely to be successful and less likely to draw attention away from your core purpose. And and allows you to expand your thinking about earned revenue. It can be a way to make profit, but it can also be a way to just expand your reach while covering your costs or covering many of your costs in a way that you couldn't have otherwise. So grounded in your mission and know what you're hoping to achieve.
Thank you. I want to give a huge thanks to Plinio and Damien for their time today and sharing their story. And Sandra, thank you to you as well. We have on your screen, you see some resources. We will be following up with an email that will include the recording of this webinar, the PowerPoint, these resources and others. So you can be on the lookout for those later today or tomorrow. There's also a link to a 4-question survey so that we can get feedback on these offerings in the future. And feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about how to apply this to your work. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.